When building a railway, it's important to make sure that you lay the rails on solid ground. Trains are heavy things, and the ground dipping just a little bit can be enough to cause an engine to derail if it's travelling at high speeds. Land subsidence isn't a new thing, and there have been cases of rails shifting out of place thanks to soft and loose ground. There was, however, one case that was very extreme indeed, involving a Furness Railway D1060 and a rather unfortunate placement in a siding. It was Thursday the 22nd of September 1892. A 7 AM morning goods train had stopped in a siding near Lindale in Furness. The driver was shunting the engine when he suddenly noticed cracks opening up in the ground beneath the locomotive. He quickly shut off steam and both he and the fireman jumped from the engine. No sooner had they done that, the ground opened up a sheer-sided hole 30 feet wide and roughly 30 feet deep. The locomotive fell in front first, with the tender remaining on the surface. The rails it stood on were snapped off, and the tracks on the two main lines either side of it were partially left suspended over the hole. Passenger trains passing the area made passengers disembark from their coaches and walk around the hole while the coaches were carefully rolled past on stable pieces of track. People flocked to see the hole, and police and railway staff had a hard time keeping people back. Some onlookers spread rumours that a whole passenger train had gone into the hole and many were killed or injured. This was untrue, but it kept people staring at the mess in wonder. Workmen brought in a crane and tool van and positioned them on the sturdiest parts of the line in an attempt to retrieve the engine. At 2:30 PM, while the men were on break, the hole collapsed another 30 feet down with the locomotive buried by dirt. Witnesses were awestruck to see a machine of such size simply vanish from sight. The hole became even wider, causing all 8 sets of track to become twisted, making none of the rails safe to use. Because the line carried important goods, such as coal coke for the nearby ironworks, it was vital that it be made stable as soon as possible. Trainloads of ballast were brought to the hole in an attempt to fill it. Eventually, it took roughly 300 wagons of ballast to fill the hole in and re-level the rest of the tracks. Nobody is 100% sure why the hole appeared in the first place, but the current explanation is a mixture of both land subsidence and old mining tunnels. The area was known to be affected by subsidence as trains were explicitly instructed to slow down while passing over that part of the line. Other nearby fields were heavily affected by land subsidence too, with the farmhouse having to be abandoned for this reason. There were also 2 levels of mine beneath the part of the line that collapsed. The upper level was abandoned, but workers on the lower level could hear engines passing overhead and predicted there would one day be an accident. It's suspected that the area had a large deposit of sand beneath it and that an underground stream had washed it away. This was further backed up by the fact it had rained heavily and flooded a few days before the accident. The mines, also having a history of caving in, only further helped weaken the land. Rather humorously, the engine is still buried there, and as it was never officially scrapped, it's currently recorded as preserved. It's unknown how deep the engine is buried under the ground, with most speculating around 90 feet while others say deeper. Over the years there have been some attempts to unearth the engine, but none have ever gone further than the planning stage. So I suppose for now it'll just have to stay where it is. But at least we know it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Machinery getting abandoned isn't a new thing. When equipment becomes broken, outdated, or simply no longer required, many people find it easiest to simply leave it where it is and move on. For railways, rolling stock is usually broken up for scrap as it's more economical, but there have been a few cases of engines and wagons becoming abandoned for one reason or another. None, however, might be more unique than the fleet of locomotives that, somehow, ended up in the middle of the desert. By the late 1800s, Bolivia had become a massive exporter of minerals, with mining making up a significant part of the country's economy. British engineers were brought to Bolivia by President Aniceto Arce after the War of the Pacific to help develop their railways, with Arce believing that a strong transportation system would help the country flourish despite Bolivia losing its connection to the ocean to Chile. After coming to an arrangement whereby Chile would allow Bolivia to use their ports, railway development began in 1888, with the engineers settling on 2-foot 6-inch gauge rails for the line. Railway infrastructure proved to be tricky to develop as the railways mostly travelled through desert land, and so there was little access to water for the steam locomotives to use. As such, a series of pipes and reservoirs had to be constructed from the Andes in order to provide water to the railway. In 1890, the town of Uyuni was established as a centre of trade and to act as a hub to connect nearby mines to the ports in Chile where the minerals would be shipped from. To run the line, engines from Robert Stephenson and Company in Britain were initially bought over, but after being taken over by the Huanchaca Company, engines built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works and various other locomotive builders in the US were preferred instead. In 1913, the decision was made to change the railway to meter-gauge tracks, and preferences switched back to British-built engines, specifically Garrett and Mayer engines built by Bayer Peacock. Workers on the railway seemed to prefer the American-built engines as they were rugged and easier to repair, but the British engines proved to be much better steamers, saving more on fuel than they cost to repair. As a result of all the traffic that came through, Uyuni became a booming trade town and a transportation hub for both passengers and goods alike. But by the 1940s, the boom slowly started turning into a bust. Plans to expand and develop the line in the area were discussed, but the local mines were slowly closing down, with the country's entire mining industry collapsing by the end of the decade. During this time, locomotives were sent to Uyuni station for repair, but as they weren't urgently needed due to the lack of mineral traffic, they were simply shunted out of the way along with carriages and various goods wagons until demand picked up again. Unfortunately, it never did. The yard the engines were stored in fell into disrepair, and the engines, left exposed to the salty desert winds, quickly started to deteriorate. Because of how remote Uyuni was from the rest of the railway network, managers of the railway felt that the cost of moving them to another depot either for scrapping or repair simply wasn't worth it, and instead decided to just leave the engines in the desert. Naturally, once folks realised that no one was coming back for the engines, people both local and from afar started to take parts from them as scrap or souvenirs, with some, more daring folks cutting up the engines themselves for metal. The conditions of the desert only helped speed up the engine's deterioration, leaving many rusted and eroded well beyond salvage. Among the engines are tender locomotives, Garretts, and Mayer locomotives. I've tried my best to find some before and after pictures of some of the other engines, but it's quite hard to confirm what's what given their current condition. Nowadays, the site has become somewhat of a tourist attraction, with many visitors coming to see the remains of the engines. Talks of turning the site into a museum have also arisen, but nothing much has come of it yet. While quite the macabre sight for most rail enthusiasts, the Uyuni train graveyard does give visitors the unique chance to get up close and personal with its exhibits. It's a shame these engines were simply left to rust, but I think you'll agree that, even as rusted shells, there's still a strange charm to them. Just don't expect to see any of them up and running anytime soon. In the height of steam preservation and restoration, people searched far and wide for engines to save from scrap and restore to full working order. Some engines were simply a little rusty, while others were so rotten they needed most of their parts fully replacing. Restoring a locomotive from a decrepit state isn't a new thing, but there's one story of an engine being found and restored that stands out over the rest, and it takes place in Brazil. Engine number 12 was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1878 for use on the Estrada de Ferro Madeira Mamor, or Madeira Mamor Railroad as it was later known, in Brazil. The line was built to meter gauge, and soon after it arrived, engine number 12 was named Coronel Church. The engine ran on the line for a while, and I can't find any reports of it ever being involved in an accident. The line was ran by a few dozen men and was a mere 6 kilometers long, but it was soon closed down in 1879 after most of the men working on the railway contracted and died of yellow fever. As a result, the locomotives and the railway were left abandoned. Number 12 was supposedly taken by local villagers and was used as a hen house, a bakery oven, and the tender was used as a water tank. After that, it was eventually abandoned and left in the rainforest. In 1909, 30 years after the railway was closed, railway officials surveying the area stumbled across the engine completely overgrown and surrounded by the forest. The firebox was full of plants, hundreds of insects had made residence in the cab, and a small tree had started to grow out the engine's funnel. Surprised by this discovery, the surveyors had the engine dragged out of the forest and taken back to the locomotive works in an attempt to restore it. After some work, the engine was fully restored to working condition and was put back into service on the 4th of July 1912. It continued to work in Brazil and was eventually withdrawn in 1940. The story behind the engine's career led to it being preserved, and is now currently on display at the Madeira Memorial Railway in Porto-Velho, Brazil. Just goes to show how rugged human engineering can be, and no matter what state something might be in, it's never impossible to try and make it work again. Sometimes, while walking around a river, you might find something interesting buried in the bank. Many people make a hobby out of searching for trinkets and treasures, finding all sorts of things from arrowheads to old coins to even, if they're lucky, gold. What many people don't expect to find while digging around riverbeds is a steam locomotive, never mind 15 of them. As railways developed and workloads got bigger, it was natural that newer, more powerful and up-to-date engines would be needed to do the work. This of course led to older, less powerful engines becoming obsolete and in need of disposal. New Zealand Railways found themselves in need of disposing of some redundant steam engines in 1927. However, they also had a few other problems to deal with. At the time, the value of scrap metal made it very uneconomical to break up or sell any rolling stock they had, meaning they were stuck finding alternate ways of disposing of their obsolete engines and wagons. On top of this, much of the Southland Plains was made up of loose rock and mud, making it difficult to keep the heavy railway lines stable. A particular point of trouble was a bend in the Oreti River near Branxholme, which was prone to eroding. Large rocks and other debris was tipped along the bend, however, this was prone to washing away after heavy rains and flooding. This was a problem for the railway that partially ran beside the river and the rail bridge that crossed it. Looking for solutions, New Zealand Railways tried to find alternatives for reinforcing the embankment. With a load of engines in need of disposal and a riverbank in need of reinforcement, it was decided that some of these engines would be dumped into the river to form a sort of defensive barrier to help prevent erosion. 15 retired engines were stripped of any useful parts and taken to Branxholme, where they were tipped into the river by a steam crane. These engines included a J-class, 4 Ks, 2 Ps, 5 Vs, and a U-class. Several old boilers were also dumped at the site, as well as locomotive tenders and parts of several U-class engines in the 1950s. Locomotives were also dumped in this manner elsewhere in New Zealand, such as Omoto and Oamaru. The barrier the engines formed wasn't perfect, but it worked much better than the rock barriers they replaced. As the years went by, the river shifted and newer reinforcements were put in place, leaving the site where the engines were dumped accessible. Naturally, it became a point of interest for sightseers and rail enthusiasts alike, as some of the engines were partially exposed, making it a fascinating site to explore. It also became a point of interest for scrap metal hunters, who have tried to salvage copper from the engine's fireboxes and bronze from the wheel bearings. By 1971, steam power had been phased out in New Zealand, and as such, enthusiasts put greater efforts into finding and restoring or preserving older steam engines. Some attention was focused on the Branxholme embankment, and in 1974, one of the K-class engines was dug out and taken to the Plains Vintage Railway to be restored. As the years have passed, more and more of these engines have been dug up, either to be preserved, restored, or simply for spare parts. Sadly, 4 of the retrieved engines were too damaged to salvage, and were outright scrapped, while the rest still remain in decrepit condition. The only exhumed engine to run again is K-Class number 88, the first engine to be retrieved and successfully restored to prove that it was plausible to do the same for other engines retrieved from embankments. While we're yet to get another river engine restored to working order, it was all thanks to the work done by enthusiasts to restore number 88 that efforts are still being made to this day to recover more of the engines. So, overall, while it's not exactly a perfect happy ending for all engines involved, New Zealand's riverbed engines tell an interesting story of railway development and camaraderie around rescuing locomotives that most would consider not worth saving. Let's hope then that any future endeavours to rescue these engines goes well, and hopefully that no more engines will get put into the river again anytime soon. The Polar Express is a film in which a Baldwin 284 S3 class steam locomotive full-on Tokyo drifts across a frozen lake. Anyone with half a brain will tell you that the physics in this scene are utter bull. It did get me thinking though. Has such a thing ever happened where a steam locomotive has found its way onto a frozen lake? And the answer is surprisingly yes. Not only that, but it's happened on more than one occasion. You're probably familiar with the concept of ice roads, where, during winter, large lakes will freeze over with a thick enough layer of ice to hold the weight of heavy goods vehicles, and can be used as a quicker, alternate way of delivering freight and machinery. What you might not expect is that people also decided to lay tracks over the ice and run locomotives on them, creating what were known as ice railways. In Bismarck, North Dakota, freight and passengers had to travel across the Missouri River via steamboat. In winter, when the river froze over, sleepers and rails were laid across the frozen river to allow trains to travel across them. Keep in mind, this was around the 1850s to the 1880s, when most locomotives used were Civil War era 440s weighing around 25 tons. After a rail bridge was built over the river in 1883, the ice railway was no longer required. In 1880, an ice railway was built across the St. Lawrence River as an act of protest against the high cost of using the Victoria Bridge in Montreal. Competing train services offered ferry transport across the river in summer, and once the river froze to 24 inches thick, a railway line was laid across it using wide sleepers and beams placed every 7 feet to help distribute the weight of passing trains. And it wasn't just America that had adopted this practice. The Trans-Siberian Railroad had also built an ice railway across the River Irtysh and the Baikal Lake. Sometimes these tracks weren't laid out of necessity, but practicality. On Christmas Eve 1879, rails were laid across the Red River when it was frozen in order to transport a new locomotive from the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia to its final destination of Winnipeg, Manitoba. The practice wasn't 100% flawless, and there were some incidents involving ice railways. On one occasion, on the 5th of January 1881, a train was passing over the St. Lawrence River when the ice beneath it started to give way. The passengers and crew managed to get clear from the engine in time before it broke through the ice and sank to the bottom of the river. The next day, a slightly different path was laid over the river and a lighter train ran across with no issues for the rest of the rail's existence. The last account I can find of an ice railway was in 1923, when one was laid across the Tanana River shortly before the completion of the Alaskan Railroad. Afterwards, it was likely a combination of heavier loads, heavier locomotives, and the construction of many bridges across these rivers that led to ice railways going out of usage. Nonetheless, ice railways were still a rather unique solution to the problem of getting across a frozen river. Just don't expect to be drifting a train across a lake anytime soon. During the Second World War, Turkey was trying to remain neutral in order to keep out of the conflict in Europe. Around 1941, Germany tried to gain Turkey's favour by providing them with some resources. Included was some DRB Class 42 steam locomotives for use on their railways. Britain, not wanting more trouble, offered Turkey 25 LMS Stania 8Fs and a few other things for them to remain neutral. The 8Fs were being used by the War Department for heavy freight work, so Churchill felt they would be a fitting gift. So why are 2 of them at the bottom of the sea? In June of 1941, a ship called the SS Thistlegorm departed from Glasgow that was destined for Egypt, carrying armoured vehicles, motorcycles, Bren guns, cases of ammunition, radio equipment, Wellington boots, aircraft parts, railway wagons, and 2 LMS Stania Class 8Fs. The locomotives were to be unloaded in Egypt and delivered to Turkey by land. Because of the Germans and Italians' control over the Mediterranean Sea, the Thistlegorm had to go all the way around Africa, stopping at Cape Town to refuel before sailing into the Red Sea in a convoy of several other Navy ships. Because of a collision at the Suez Canal, the ship couldn't reach Alexandria, so it was moored at a point close to Ras Mohammed. German intelligence suspected a ship full of reinforcements was on the way, so 2 planes were dispatched to find and destroy the troop carrier. As there was no troop carrier, the planes decided to bomb the largest ship in the fleet, this being the Thistlegorm. The bombs hit hold number 4, and the resulting explosion from the bombs and ammunition stored led to the ship sinking. Most of the cargo remained inside the ship as it sank, apart from the 2 locomotives that were on the top deck. Both were blown off of either side of the ship and came to rest on the ocean floor, with one of them believed to have been directly struck by a bomb. The ship was mostly forgotten until 1990, when the area became a diving resort. The ship is only 30 meters or so underwater, meaning it can be accessed without special training or specialist gear, making it a great diving spot for tourists. Both locomotives rest either side of the ship, now acting as underwater attractions and home for the local fish, albeit rusty and covered in aquatic life. Most modern diesel locomotives aren't technically diesel-driven. Instead, the wheels are driven by electric motors that are powered by electricity generated by the locomotive's engine, essentially making most modern diesels glorified generators on wheels, but powerful nonetheless. A Canadian National M420 can generate over 2,000 horsepower from its engine, so in terms of energy output, they're essentially mini power stations on rails. So if most diesel locomotives are just big generators on wheels, that raises the question, how much power can they generate? It can vary from engine to engine, but I don't think anyone is too sure as it's never really been tested. What I can tell you is they can generate roughly enough electricity to power a small neighbourhood. How do I know this? Because that's exactly what happened to Canadian National Locomotive number 3502 in January of 1998. It was the height of winter in Butcherville, Quebec. A harsh ice storm had just rolled in and swept across the town, followed by another one, and then another one. The ice built up and eventually caused the power grid to fail, leaving thousands of people without power and, more importantly, heating. The mayor at the time needed a way to provide power to emergency services and emergency heated shelters. They didn't have anything to hand that could generate enough electricity when suddenly she had a brainwave. Why not use trains to power the town? I know that sounds like a crazy idea, but it wasn't out of the question. For many years before diesel power, steam locomotives have been used as sources of heat and power in emergency situations. The boiler could be used to produce large quantities of heated water, and fuel from the tenders could be used for smaller fires. It's not unheard of for some engines to be taken off the rails and become repurposed as a stationary boiler. So when you think that a town needs electricity and a railway happens to be close by that runs locomotives that are just giant mobile generators, the idea becomes much less audacious. The mayor contacted Canadian National and requested an engine be brought to a level crossing close to the town hall. Once there, it was met with a large crane that lifted it off the rails and onto the road. The locomotive was then driven the remaining 1,000 feet towards the nearest point they could plug it into the grid. And when I say driven, I mean literally. It was driven under its own power down the road with the wheels carving grooves into the tarmac. From there, it was hooked to the grid and set to produce roughly 375 kilowatts of power at 60 Hz, well below its maximum possible output. A second locomotive, number 3508, was brought in with plans to use it to power the local high school, but this meant moving it across an overpass. It was instead used as a backup generator when it was decided that the overpass wouldn't likely be able to take the weight of the engine. With the locomotive hooked up, it was able to power several municipal buildings and provide enough power to emergency services to organize the situation and operate. Eventually, the town got its power back and the diesels were put back onto the rails. They both had to be serviced to repair the damage sustained to the driving gears and other parts after they were literally driven on the road. As handy as they were, I doubt anything similar would happen again soon. 1, because most places have upgraded their connection to their power grids, and 2, because the engines cost roughly $2 million a piece, meaning the railway companies wouldn't likely want them going off the rails anytime soon. Still though, just shows that not all crazy sounding ideas are bad ideas. Trains work best when they have tracks to travel on. It's steel on steel that allows trains to pull such heavy loads so quickly in the first place, so you'd think that driving a locomotive off-road would be a terrible idea, and you'd be somewhat correct. But that didn't stop some engines from finding a way of running without rails. Logging locomotives had to tackle some pretty tough terrain. Steep grades, bumpy ground, and mud are all difficult enough to traverse, never mind having to lay rails for engines to run on too. Laying rails was essential, however, for some logging companies, as it meant they could move lumber all year round instead of having to wait for winter. Companies that couldn't afford rails or logged in areas where laying rails was impractical or even impossible had no choice but to wait for winter, so they could load their lumber onto sleds and have teams of horses pull them. Horses, however, could only pull so much weight, and it would take several horses just to pull one fully loaded sled. Not only that, but when going downhill, it was very difficult to keep control of the heavy lumber sleds, often leading to accidents. Ideally, what these loggers needed was something with the same power as a locomotive that could run on regular ground. Traction engines were used by some companies, but they weren't always reliable in mud or heavy snow. Then one day, a chap by the name of Alvin Lombard came along. While discussing ideas with his colleague Johnson Woodbury, Woodbury told Lombard of an idea he had for an off-road machine that could help drag lumber sleds in winter, but didn't have the money or resources to put together a prototype. A few days later, Lombard happened to meet an executive of a logging company and shared the idea, to which the executive said he'd be first in line for one of these machines if Lombard built one. That was all Lombard needed to hear, quickly drawing up plans for the logging machine. The design used a pair of track treads, each powered by their own engine which received steam from a vertical boiler. Having the treads be individually powered allowed the machine to steer, but horses would still be at the front of the contraption to help guide the direction it would be going in when in motion. He took the drawings to the Waterville Iron Works and, by Thanksgiving 1900, the prototype was completed. Upon being steamed for a public demonstration, the machine not only terrified locals, but the tracks broke, sending Lombard back to the drawing board. The track problem was fixed by using stronger steel, and 2 of these machines were built for use around Eustis, Maine. Lombard still felt he could do better and came up with a more refined version. The new design was essentially a saddle tank locomotive, but with smaller cylinders that would power the tracked wheels through a series of gears and skis mounted at the front. The skis could be turned, allowing the machine to steer on its own without the need for horses to guide it, and could also be swapped out for wheels, allowing it to run on roads. The first of these new, refined log haulers was sold in 1903, proving to be an instant success. The saddle tank helped put more weight on the engine's tracks, giving it better traction. They could run just as well on wood or coal, and their water tanks could be refilled easily by either pumping water from nearby ponds, or in winter by shoveling snow into the tank. Where once between 4 and 8 horses were needed to pull one heavy sled, only one log hauler was needed to pull several sleds at once. Later haulers were recorded being able to pull 12 sleds in ideal conditions, with the record for the longest train pulled by a single hauler being 24 sleds long. Operating a log hauler required a team of 3 to 4 people. A driver and fireman would reside in the rear cab, keeping pressure in the boiler and driving the engine, while a steersman would be sat at the front steering. Some crews also had a conductor who acted as a brakeman and kept an eye on the sleds during transit, though sometimes this job was handled by the driver instead. Without doubt, the one with the hardest job was the steersman, especially in winter. While the driver and fireman got to stay cozy in the cab, the steersman was at the front of the engine, usually exposed to the elements while having to turn a cold metal wheel. The only thing they could do to fight off the cold was bundle up, but even then sparks from the engine's funnel were known to set their clothes on fire if they weren't careful. Many better off steersmen would buy leather clothes to wear while driving to keep themselves from being ignited. Some companies modified their haulers by building a small shelter on the front of them to provide some protection for the steersman, but this not only limited their field of view, but also made it much harder for them to jump clear should the hauler crash or tip over. And boy, did they do that a lot. It was common practice for many logging companies to establish roads going downhill from logging sites to wood yards, as it was next to impossible to pull the heavy timber up even shallow hills. Because of this, most log haulers would have to pull sleds downhill, and the weight of the sleds combined with the hauler's lack of brakes often led to them skidding down hills, turning too sharp and jackknifing their loads, or straight up sliding into a ditch and rolling onto their side. Engines having dented water tanks and rebuilt cabs were a very common sight. To help provide extra traction, hay was sometimes sprinkled along the roads ahead of the haulers, but this wasn't always effective as deer were known to come along and eat it before the slow-moving haulers passed over it. Despite the dangers and operational hazards, Lombard steam log haulers were quite popular with those who used them, with 83 being built in total. They were so popular in fact that not only were they used in the US, Canada and even Russia, but the Phoenix Manufacturing Company in Wisconsin even licensed the design from Lombard so they could produce their own log haulers. The Phoenix design worked similar to Lombard's but with a few minor changes. Rather than 2 cylinders, the Phoenix engines had 4, 2 on each side which pointed downwards, driving a shaft similar to a Shay locomotive. The other main difference is that the Phoenix engines kept their water in well tanks mounted under the boiler, as opposed to saddle tanks like their Lombard counterparts. Aside from that, both machines were quite similar in performance and handling, though Phoenix went on to build over 200 of their haulers. As amazing as these logging locomotives were, times changed and other machines took their spot in the limelight, namely bulldozers. Thanks to bulldozers, it was easy to make a relatively level and rugged road through forests, making it easier to lay rails or allow newer trucks to access logging sites. Not only were these roads much safer than pulling logs via sled, but also allowed companies to move logs all year round. While Lombard's machines could work all year round, they still needed the ground to be frozen solid and covered in ice and snow to move logs effectively. Lombard tried to build new haulers with both petrol and diesel engines as times changed, but these weren't as powerful as the original steam designs and ultimately couldn't keep up. The last of Lombard's steam haulers fell out of use in 1929, with the last of the Phoenix machines retiring not long afterwards. Despite only a small number of each being built, quite a few have been preserved, mostly around the northeast of the US, southern Canada, and even as far away as Finland. A few of them are even in working order. The Lombard steam logging engines, while not exactly the most elegant or safest machines, still proved to be a massive boon to logging companies that otherwise would have been stuck with horses. On top of that, they were some of the first machines ever to effectively use track treads, further helping their development and application. Just goes to show then that, sun or snow, steam was not only effective on the rails, but off-road too. Subscribe for more.